The Follower by Cynthia Asquith. Mrs. Mead had been in the nursing home with heart trouble for 3 weeks, and her doctor, to whom she had confided the terror that obsessed her, had at last persuaded her to see the famous psychoanalyst, Dr. Stone. She awaited his visit in great trepidation. It would not be easy to tell him of her fantastic experiences, hallucinations, her own doctor insisted on calling them. A quarter of an hour before the time when she expected Dr. Stone, there was a knock on the door. "I'm a little early, Mrs. Mead," said a smooth voice from behind the screen, "and I must ask you to forgive my fancy dress fall appearance. I was very careless with the spirit lamp, and am obliged to wear this mask for some time." As he approached her bedside, Mrs. Mead saw that her visitor's face was entirely concealed by a black mask with 2 small holes and a slit for his eyes and mouth. "Now, Mrs. Mead," he said, seating himself in a chair close to the bed, "I want you to tell me all about this mysterious trouble that is thought to be affecting your physical health. Please be perfectly frank with me. When did this, shall I say, obsession begin, and what precisely is it?" "Very well," said Mrs. Mead. "I will try to tell you the whole story. It began years ago, when I first went to live in Regent's Park. One afternoon I was most disagreeably struck by the appearance of a man who was loafing about outside the Baker Street tube station. I can't tell you how strong and horrible an impression he made upon me. I can only say that there was something utterly hateful about his face, with its bold, malignant eyes, lashless eyes, searched me like unshaded lights. He seemed to leer at me with a "so there you are" sort of look, and the queer thing was that, though I'd never to my knowledge seen him, and, as I say, his appearance came to me as a shock, yet it was not a shock of complete surprise. In the violent distaste I felt for him there was a faint element of, shall I say, subconscious recognition, as though he reminded me of something I had once dreamt or imagined. I don't know. I vaguely noticed that he had on a black slouch hat and no tie, but a sort of greenish muffler round his neck. Otherwise his clothes were ordinary. Like the description of Mr. Hyde, he gave an impression of deformity, without any nameable malformation. His face was horrible, moistly pale, like a toadstool. It's no good. I can't describe him. I can only repeat that the aversion he inspired in me was extraordinarily violent. I was conscious of his stare as I hurried past him and went down the steps, and it was a great relief to disappear into the lift and be whirled away in the tube. Though I had plenty to do that day, I couldn't quite dismiss him from my mind, and when I returned by tube late in the evening, it was a horrid shock to find him lurking at the top of the steps, just as though he were waiting for me. This time there was no doubt that he definitely leered at me, and I thought he faintly shook his head. I hurried past him. Soon I had that horrid sense of being followed, and glanced over my shoulder. Sure enough, there he was, just a few paces behind, and as I turned, he slightly raised his hat. I almost ran home, and I cannot say what a relief it was to hear my front door slam behind me. Well, I saw him the next day, and the next, and practically every day. The distaste with which I recognized him became a definite shudder, and each time his cynical glance seemed to grow bolder. Several times he followed me towards my house, but never right up to the door. I made tentative inquiries at the little shops round the tube station, but no one seemed to have noticed him. The dread of meeting him became an absolute obsession. Soon I gave up going in the tube, and would make long detours in order to avoid that upper part of Baker Street. "You minded him as much as all that, did you?" asked the doctor. "Yes." "Go on, don't let me interrupt you." "For some time," continued Mrs. Mead, "I did not see him, and then there was a hideous incident. Returning from a walk in the park one day, I saw quite a large crowd just outside the gate. A little girl had been run over. An ambulance man was carrying her lifeless form, and a policeman and some women were attending to the demented mother. Amongst all those shocked and pitying faces, Suddenly I saw one vile, mocking face, its familiar features horribly distorted in a gloating grin. With positive glee he pointed at the dead child, and then he turned and leered at me. After this horrible encounter, you may be sure I shunned Upper Baker Street. But one day, just as I was starting to walk through the park, the heaviest rain I've ever seen came on, so I rushed towards the taxis at the top of the street and jumped into the first one in the rank. A small boy opened the door for me, and to avoid getting my hat wet, I gave him the address to give the driver. To my surprise, we started off at a terrific pace. I looked up and saw a rather crouched back and a greenish muffler. The speed at which we were going was insane, and I banged on the window. The driver turned. Imagine my nightmare horror when I recognized the dreaded face grinning at me through the glass. Heaven knows why we didn't crash at once. Instead of watching the road, the creature on the box kept turning round to grin and gloat at me. We went faster and faster, whirling through the traffic. I was so sick with horror that in spite of the appalling speed, I would at all costs have jumped out. But struggle as I might, I could not turn the handle. I think I screamed and screamed and screamed. I was simply flung about the taxi. At last there was an appalling shock. I can just remember the tinkle of breaking glass and the awful pain in my head, and then no more. When I came to, I was in hospital, where for hours I'd been unconscious from concussion. I began to ask questions, but could only learn that I'd been picked up from the debris of a taxi which had crashed into some railings, and that it was a miracle I'd not been killed. As for the driver, he had unaccountably disappeared before the police arrived, and no one claimed to have seen him. The taxi bore no number and couldn't be identified. The police were completely baffled. After this, I insisted on leaving the neighbourhood and made my husband take a house in Chelsea. Nearly a year passed, and I began to hope that I should never see him again, but I became ill, and after endless consultations a very serious operation was decided on. Everything was arranged, and the evening before the date fixed, I drove to the nursing home with the sinking sensation natural to the occasion. I rang the bell, and the door was promptly opened by a short man. I almost screamed. In spite of the incongruous livery, it was him. There he stood, sickly pale as ever, and with that awful, evil, intimate smile. In a wild panic I sprang from the door and back into the taxi, which was waiting with my luggage. Directly I got home I cancelled the operation. In spite of all the Harley Street opinions, I recovered. The operation was proved unnecessary. Mrs. Mead paused in her narrative. The listener spoke. Then this being, whatever he is, on this occasion may have been said to have done you a good turn, he asked. Yes, answered Mrs. Mead. Perhaps, but it didn't make me dread him any the less. Oh, the ghastly dreams I had, that I'd been given the anaesthetic and was thought to be unconscious, but I wasn't, and I saw the surgeon approach, and as he bent over, his face was the face. Did you ever see him again, Mrs. Mead? I'm sorry, answered the patient hastily, but the next time I saw him I can't tell you about. It's still too unbearable. There are things one cannot speak about. It was then I understood why he'd pointed at that dead child and leered at me out of his vile little eyes. That was a long time ago, but the dread is always with me. You see, I still have one child left. I'm always looking for what I fear. I can never leave my house without expecting to see him. What if one day I should meet him in my house? I do not think you will ever do that, Mrs. Mead. I suppose you think the whole thing is an illusion, Dr. Stone? And in any case, I don't suppose I've been able to give any impression of what the creature is like, sighed Mrs. Mead. The listener rose from his chair and leant over the invalid. Is his face like this? He asked, and as he spoke, he whipped off his mask. No one who heard it will ever forget Mrs. Mead's scream. 2 nurses rushed into her room, followed by Dr. Stone, who, punctual to his appointment, had that moment arrived. The dead woman lay on the bed. There was no one else in the room.